Yes, we can hear you, Mark.
Amazing. All right, everybody, welcome. I'm excited you're here. Welcome to the nofamass conference. We have a great workshop ahead of us, along with a great summer conference. So we are currently in the native perennial food plants for your edible landscape workshop. I will read the description for this workshop, get into the presenter bio, then just go over some primary things, and then we'll hop right into the content. So, one place in habitats that meet their needs, native plants tend to be well adapted to our climate and have few pests, disease, or other maintenance problems. This illustrated talk will describe the growth habitat, preferred habitat, required care, food, and other uses, aesthetic appeal, and propagation techniques for over 25 native perennial plants you can include in your edible landscape. The plants range from trees to bushes and ground covers to roots and even vines. If you want to create an edible hedge, an edible bed, a foundation planting, a U-pick venue, or a forest garden, you will discover that there are a variant of native plant foods to choose from to fill your space, suitable for farmers, gardeners, homesteaders, and landscapers. And then I will read Dani's bio real quick. And then we'll just go over things and then we'll get going. So Dani Baker is a self-taught gardener and organic farmer who began planning and planting her permaculture-inspired edible forest garden in 2013. Her book, The Home-Scale Forest Garden: How to Plan, Plant, and tend a resilient edible landscape, was published by Chelsea Green in May of 2022. Dani loves to inspire others to embark on their own edible forest journey at any scale. So let's just kick this off with the land acknowledgement. This conference is presented on land that has been stewarded by Indigenous peoples since before European colonization. As we work to heal the destruction caused by colonization, we appreciate your support, solidarity, and continued learning. We will drop the link, nativeland.ca, in the chat down below, and we encourage you to click on that and learn more about the land. This upcoming weekend, we'll have two caucus groups. We'll have a BIPOC caucus group and a white ally caucus group. We encourage you to join. We'll have more info about that. Yes, and then I'll just read over this. Let's see, we aim to bring the light of ancestral wisdom of Indigenous peoples of the global South, including the Amara, but not totally sure how to pronounce these. I don't want to butcher them, but yeah. Thank you. We celebrate that restorative agriculture is rooted in longstanding cultural practices of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. In an agricultural system built on stolen land and the forced labor and exploitation of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, our conference aims to center equity in our food system. And then these are a number of organizations in our region. If any look like they're in your vicinity, we encourage you to check them out. Thank you to Stonyfield Organic, who is our partner level sponsor. Next slide will include some more sponsors. I'll just wait on that for maybe 10 seconds so you can look over them. Then I'll go on to a couple more sponsors. All right, cool. And we will also have this weekend a soil health table. We'll have a nofamass technical specialist create soil health plans for your fields or gardens. There'll be a team ready and equipped with microscopes and recommendations. So if you got some soil, bring it in and get some great recommendations. And don't forget, we do have some online bidding. I will also drop a link for that in the chat. If you have your phone on, you can scan the QR code. I went over some of the stuff offered yesterday, and there's some pretty neat stuff. So yeah, and I will now turn the time over to Dani.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, NOFA, for hosting my presentation. Native perennial food plants for your edible landscape. Uh-oh. Oh, there. Okay, just so you know where I'm located, I'm on an island in the St. Lawrence River. Our organic farm is on Wellesley Island, which is right where that star is. And it's about 2 hours south of Ottawa. It's a hardiness zone 4. And this is the logo. This is the shape of our island. It's about a 9-mile long island. Our farm is right at the base of that windmill. We do have wind and solar power on a farm. And we're very diversified. So we raise meat goats, we raise beef cattle, we have some ducks and chickens. We do a market garden for vegetables. And we have a few campsites on our land. We host volunteers year round. We do tours of the farm and of the edible forest. This is me giving a tour of the edible forest. And we have an occasional event on the farm. So 11 years ago, I took a 2-hour class on permaculture. Steve Gabriel came down from Cornell to our local cooperative extension. I'd never heard the word before, didn't know what it meant, but I was so taken by the concepts that I decided there and then I was going to plant an edible forest. And these are just some shots of my landscaped acre. Peonies are edible, by the way. Summer shot, late summer shot, fall, and winter. So everything I'm going to talk about today, I kind of learned as I researched, planned, and planted, and then maintained my garden over the last 11 years. So native perennial food plants have many virtues. They provide food and habitat for native wildlife. They're relatively disease and pest resistant. Many tolerate a range of soil and habitat conditions. And I'm going to talk about that when it's relevant with the plants I'm going to discuss. They require minimal care compared to, let's say, European currants that need to be pruned every year. The clove currant, which is native, hardly needs any pruning at all. Resilient in face of vagaries of weather. They may have multiple uses, and they may occupy any one of the 7 permaculture layers. And if you're not familiar with them, overstory, tall trees, understory trees, maybe 10 to 30 feet, shrubs, herbaceous plants, ground covers, roots, and vines. And I've organized my talk according to those categories and in that order. Oops, let me go back to previous. And I'm really interested in aesthetic appeal. So many or most of these plants have multi-season aesthetic appeal, and I'll talk about that as we go over them. So first we're going to start with the overstory trees. And these are in alphabetical order. American persimmon. So this is a plant that's native to the mid-Atlantic states. It's an understory germinator. Beautiful colored leaves in the fall. A delicious fruit that ripens really late in the season and needs several frosts really to sweeten up and soften up. And then the upper right is the flowers. They're kind of subtle underneath the branches. And then that, do you see my pointer? Can you guys see my pointer?
Yes, we can see it. Okay,
good. That is a very immature fruit. And I'm thrilled this year, 3 of my persimmons have immature fruit. I'm so excited. It can do in a little shade. It's an understory germinator, so it can grow in shade or full sun. It fruits better, like all plants, if there's, like most plants, in full sun. There are cultivars that you can purchase that grow maybe 15 or 20 feet. The native seedlings will grow quite tall, maybe 60 or 80 feet. So just a delightful plant to have. Seems to withstand, the seedlings do well for me. And a couple of the cultivars that are rated for zone 4, I think it's Meter and Yates, are still alive. So that's good news. I would like questions at the end. So if you have questions, you can write them right in the chat. And then when I finish going over the plants, I'll address them. So this is basswood. So this grows wild in my woods. So this is a winter picture of the basswood. They grow in complete shade. So this is a bass, or in full sun, very versatile. They can take shade, they can take sun, they can take wet, and they can take well-drained dry soil. It's growing under an oak in my woods. And the flowers are edible. You can make a lovely tea with the flowers. The leaves are edible. You can use the leaves like lettuce in a salad. And pretty heart-shaped leaves. When the tree grows in shade, the leaves get very large, so they absorb more sun, and it assumes this elegant shape. And in full sun, the tree can get very large with a very large trunk and a huge canopy, and it doesn't form this graceful shape under those circumstances. So edible, beautiful, easy to grow. Locust. So locusts are nitrogen fixing plants, and they have edible parts. So the honey locust, which is in the upper left, they both turn, honey and black locust both turn beautiful yellow colors in the fall. They're both legumes. The honey locust has pods that can be 8 inches long and 2 inches wide, and they're edible when they're green. You can scrape off the inners of the lining of the pods, and it tastes like honey. And both the honey locust and the black locust make wonderful honey when they're very attractive to bees, and they make wonderful honey. The black locust is considered invasive in some places, so check about that before you plant it. In New York, it's considered invasive, but if there is a stand near where you are, you're allowed to plant it. And my neighbor has a stand of black locust on his property, so I figure I'm in the clear. But it's a wonderful tree. It grows to can grow to maybe 80 feet tall with a rather narrow canopy, maybe 25 feet. The wood is very high in BTUs, very useful for firewood, and it doesn't rot, so it's great for fence posts. That is a picture of an H-brace made out of locust logs. The flowers are edible, very attractive to pollinators, and I just think the tree is attractive in all seasons. It has the tiny leaves, so it lets in a lot of light underneath. And what I do in my edible forest, I have them, I let them grow very tall, and I trim up the branches up to 30 feet if I have to. So there's lots of ambient light that comes in through the leaves, but also underneath for any fruit trees or other trees that need more light that are growing underneath. Down in the lower right is a cultivar of the black locust called the purple robe locust. And it's very much like the black locust, not quite as tall, but it has these beautiful purplish flowers. And the lower left, I'm showing you the cool thing about these locust trees is you can pollard them or you can coppice them and they grow right back. So coppicing is cutting the trunk right down to the ground. Pollarding is when you cut the branches at whatever level you want to maintain the tree, and then it grows back. And this lower left picture are honey locusts on my island lining a road, and they've been pollarding them regularly, and they've just grown back, and they're keeping them to 15 feet. So even if you have a small area, you can, if you don't have a lot of height available to you, you can keep these trees 10, 15, 20 feet as long as you maintain them. Or you can just cut them down and let them grow back till they get the height you want, then cut them down again. Tamarack. So this is not a food plant, but it's so beautiful and it's native. I had to include it. And it does provide food for animals, for birds and other animals. So, and it also has medicinal applications. So it's a beautiful deciduous conifer. It likes to grow in bogs. It's native. It grows naturally in bogs, very wet soil. The cones are this gorgeous color when they first appear in the spring, and then they turn brown. They're rather small, maybe half an inch. The leaves are this lovely pale green, or the needles. Lovely colors in the fall. Makes a great windbreak. They grow extremely quickly and quite tall. So, and I know Native Americans use them since the wood also does not rot. It's very water resistant. So they used to make snowshoes out of them. Okay, paper birch. This is another lovely tree. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. it tends to be a pioneer tree and grows in kind of monoculture stands where there's been disturbance on the land. It grows very quickly. It doesn't have a long life, maybe 40, 60 years, but beautiful in the winter, lovely green leaves against the white bark in the summer, and then yellow leaves in the fall. And you can tap it and make a syrup. Unfortunately, whereas maple syrup is 40 to 1, 40 gallons to 1 gallon of syrup, birch is 100 to 1. You need 100 gallons to make 1 gallon of syrup. But I was thinking, if you're enterprising, people are bottling the sap of maple, just the plain sap, and charging big bucks for it. So as long as you're going to be bottling something, just bottle the birch sap and sell it. I think that might be a profitable enterprise. Anyway, I just think they're lovely, and I have them in my garden. Mine are very immature. They don't turn white. They take a few years before the bark turns white. So mine are still just brown, but I'm hopeful that they'll mature and they'll be aesthetically pleasing, and someday I might tap them. So now we're going to move on to understory trees. Those were the overstory trees. So first is the American plum. So this is there are quite a few native plum trees. This is the one I'm familiar with. It grows to maybe 15 feet by 15. Lovely flowers in the spring, pretty colors in the fall, and a fruit that's maybe an inch or an inch and a half in diameter. It ripens maybe in August. The skin stays very, very tart while the flesh gets quite sweet. I like to make a jam out of it. You could probably make pies with it. Relatively, carefree for a plum. I mean, the only thing I've pruned on this plum is the branches that intrude onto this, this little bridge so I can walk by. But they're used to hold riverbanks because they can tolerate a high water table for a short period of time. So I planted mine at the edge of a couple of ponds that I dug on in my garden, and they're thriving. They're doing really great. And these will have plums when my American European crosses, my cultivar plums, won't have plums. So for example, this year we had 4 frosts in May. They killed all the buds, most of all the buds from my cultivar plum trees, but this one is loaded. So easy. Hazelbird. So this is actually a cross. Because I'm in zone 4, I can't grow a hazel. They're not quite hardy enough, but if you cross it with a filbert, which is more hardy, the hazel has bigger nuts, the filbert is hardier, or the other way around, but whatever. They produce nuts for me, and it's really a useful tree. It grows to maybe 20 feet tall, but it's the stems kind of clump from the base. So it makes a great windbreak because from the ground up, you have branches and leaves. And then it has these rather attractive clusters of nuts in their husks, really interesting colors in the fall. And it's in the birch family. So it has these catkins that hang all winter, very decorative on the tree. And then very early in the spring, they start turning color, and the pollen becomes available. So you get a little color really early before anything is leafed out. And if you can get to the nuts before the squirrels, they're really quite tasty. So it is partly native and partly not, but I'm talking about it anyway. Pawpaw. So pawpaw, again, is native to the mid-Atlantic states. It's an understory germinator. So when it's a seedling, it needs quite a bit of shade, like a 50% shade cloth. Or what I do is I just take slats from a pallet and I hammer them in with the tallest one to the south, because that's when the sun is the highest. And then I graduate them around, and that provides ample shade until the seedling gets maybe 2 or 3 feet tall, and then, or like 2 years, and then it doesn't need any shade anymore. Very attractive flowers. They're about 1.5 inches across, and they're these upside down purplish bells. The tree is pollinated by flies, or you can hand pollinate it. And it has a fruit that's about the shape and size of a mango, but inside it tastes like either vanilla custard or banana custard. My trees, I've had my trees in about 7 or 8 years. I started with grafted trees, and they did not survive my winters. So now I just have seedlings, and they've been surviving, but I've not yet had fruit. I'm hopeful that someday soon I will, because they've been flowering for 2 or 3 years. Really pretty colors in the fall. And down in the lower right, you can see they're very tropical looking when they're in full leaf, and with fairly large leaves and a lot of foliage. So when the leaves fall, they actually provide a lot of mulch. And I understand that they may have some insecticidal qualities. So if you have a bush or a tree that might be vulnerable to some pests that are crawling up from the ground, if you scatter these leaves around underneath, it might help deter them. Redbud. I love this tree. So this also is native to mostly warmer areas than where I live, but it's a nitrogen fixing legume. It has flowers covering all its branches before it leaves out, and those flowers are edible, as are the pods. So you can see the pods here, just like pea pods. Beautiful heart-shaped leaves that are reddish when they first emerge, and then they turn green. They turn shades of yellow in the fall. It forms it can grow in partial shade. It doesn't like wind, but it can grow in the shade, actually quite deep shade, or in the sun. It doesn't like wet feet. It needs well-drained soil, and it doesn't like wind. But they're just beautiful specimen plants, or if you need a nitrogen fixer, they're gorgeous. They'll grow to maybe 30 feet by 30 feet. And that lovely vase-like shape. So they're even attractive in the winter because the shape of the branches and the trunk is pretty elegant. Edible flowers and edible pods. And this is my baby redbud, age 2. So all of the legumes can be can be grown from seed. You do have to often scarify and stratify the seed. So stratification is keeping it cold, like in the freezer, or if it's just hanging on the tree all winter, because it needs to go through a cold season before it'll germinate. And scarification is breaking the surface of the seed so that water can penetrate. So you can do that. Most of these legumes are pioneer plants, and they're going to come in when there's a fire, let's say, that kind of disturbance, and the fire actually breaks down the coating of the seeds so they'll germinate. But you can do it by dropping them in water that you've boiled for maybe 24 hours. You boil the water first, then you drop the seed in and leave it in for about 24 hours. Or you can, what I like to do is I just put the seed between 2 pieces of sandpaper, and I rub the sandpaper until I feel like there's enough of the shell that's worn off that the water can get in. So this one I started from seed. I'm very proud of it. Okay, so now we're getting to shrubs. So the first one I want to talk about is Aronia. It's also known as, oh boy, now I'm losing it. Okay, it'll come to me. It's very astringent. If you try to eat it raw, it makes your mouth feel really dry and very unpleasant. But if you cook it, the berries, that goes away. And you can see they're very, very dark in color. They have a lot of nutritional value, a lot of antioxidants. These berries ripen in late summer. So like late August, September. The longer you leave them on the vine, the sweeter they'll get. And I know people who drop them in this is really bad. You know, when you grind up kale and fruit and stuff, they drop them in those things to give it some color and a little flavor. But really pretty flowers in the spring. These are very easy to harvest. As you see, they grow in bunches. They're maybe 3/4 of an inch across, the berries, and you can just grab the whole bunch in your hand and pull it off. So very efficient to harvest, really beautiful colors in the fall. These guys will grow in wet soil, in dry soil, in shade, in sun. You don't have to prune them. They're just so resilient and versatile. The only thing you might have to do is stake the branches when they're laden with the berries, because they're so laden that they might fall to the ground. So you might have to stake up a branch or two. But other than that, there are cultivars that only grow to 4 feet. That's Nero. Viking grows to 6 feet. Mackenzie grows to 8 feet. So you can take your pick of the size you want, and just a really attractive, you know, carefree native plant. Beach plum. So beach plums are native to the Northeast coast. They tend to grow in sand, but for some reason, mine are growing in my heavy clay. I can't explain it. They can be quite large bushes, like maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, or you can train them to a single stem and make a small tree. Beautiful plum-like blooms in the spring, but they bloom later than other plums. So I have a problem with the plum coprolio. It's a pest of all kinds of fruits, apples, the plum family and the stone fruits as well. But this blooms later, so those pests don't bother it. And it has 1/2 inch across plums that make a fabulous jam. And my beach plums this year, even though those frosts I mentioned killed most of the buds on my cherry trees and my plum trees, these are absolutely loaded with beach plums this year. It's just amazing. And pretty colors in the fall. So if you have the space, I do prune them a little to open up the centers and to cut out really low-lying branches. But other than that, pretty carefree and quite productive for me. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the brambles, but the raspberries, blackberries, and black raspberries are all native. So if you like these kind of berries and you want to have native plants, just plant them everywhere. I'm just not, I mean, most people are familiar with these plants, so I'm not going to really spend a whole lot of time. If you have questions about them after, I'm happy to answer them. The cultivar, I like thornless blackberries because I do U-pick in my garden, and boy, thorny blackberries are really hazardous. So the cultivar that works the best for me is Triple Crown. It fruits on 2nd-year canes. And if we don't have a super harsh winter, I get fruit, because a super harsh winter will kill the canes because it's really rated for zone 6. But I planted, I try to match these things, these plants that aren't hardy to my zone. I try to match them with habitats that will be conducive to them. So this is planted on a fairly steep south-facing slope. And it's actually planted right in front of an Asian pear, which is also on that slope for a similar reason, because it's not super hardy to my zone. And I use the pear to trellis it. So I don't have to build a trellis. I just, as the canes get long, I just stick them through the branches of the Asian pear, and they both seem to get along with each other fine. And, think about in nature, brambles are growing right next to bushes and trees, right? So, okay, they're also attractive in the landscape. So the upper left is a picture of some leaves of a blackberry in the fall. So some of mine turn these gorgeous colors. And then they're just a really nice accent, the raspberries in the landscape. Oh, clove currant. This is one of my favorites. So this is a native currant bush. Beautiful yellow flowers with a magnificent aroma that smells a little like cloves in the spring. Which you can smell from yards and yards and yards away. Really pretty intricate leaves, and the fruit is like a black currant, but not like the European ones, but not as pungent. And they're starting to ripen now. So I wait until most of them turn black, and the longer you leave them, the sweeter they'll get, of course. But because they're ripening in August, if I know there's going to be a lot of rain, I pick them all, because they tend to get saturated in my heavy clay, which doesn't drain great. The fruits tend to get saturated at that time of year if there's a heavy rain, and then they start to go bad on the vine. So I like to pick them all before there's a heavy rain. And the really good black ones are great to eat fresh, and a mixture is great for processing into jam, because the less ripe ones have more pectin than the riper ones, and beautiful colors in the fall. So this is the Crandall cultivar. It only grows to 4 feet by 4 feet and has kind of a drooping growth habit. So it won't take up a lot of space, and it can take some shade. It can take full sun. It's drought tolerant. A versatile plant. I almost never prune it. All I do is prune. If there's a branch that's touching the ground, I might take it off, or I might just clip it to the ground and make a new plant. Elderberry. So elderberries are native. They're growing in my woods. Well, they would be if the deer didn't, completely decimate them. Lovely flowers that are edible, berries that are edible. Both need to be cooked. They can be toxic to some people if eaten in large quantities if they're not cooked. So some people bread the flowers. You can also make a syrup out of them. You can make a liqueur out of the flowers. The berries make great pies or sauces, jams, but also have medicinal quality. A lot of people make syrup out of them or tinctures for their immune boosting capacity. They're also a trap crop for birds. They tend to ripen at the same time as my grapes, and birds tend to prefer them to the grapes. So I have lots of elderberries. I'm happy to share them with the birds if they spare my grapes. They grow very fast. They grow in clumps and they sucker, and they'll grow to like 10 or 12 feet in one season. Sometimes they'll actually grow from the ground up flower and fruit in one season. By the third season, it's time to, they start to lose their quality. So the 4-year-old stems, I usually prune out, or they die by themselves and I prune them out. Some people, people who grow them commercially sometimes just cut the whole plant down every year. I've grown a bunch of different cultivars, which have bigger berries, but I prefer the wild variety because I think the berries just have more flavor, even though they're smaller. Just a really pretty plant. And in the landscape, it grows pretty lushly. It can form a visual screen, a sound barrier for you, and just lovely in flower and in fruit. High bush cranberry. If you have a wet area, this is a great, great plant. Beautiful flowers in the spring. The upper picture is what my berries look like now. So they're starting to turn color in the fall, deep red and crimson leaves. And then the berries stay on the bush all winter long if it's not a real droughty year when the animals come and eat them early. So, and then the songbirds, the returning songbirds eat them in the spring. They're also edible. So they need to be hit by a few frosts to soften up. And I won't say they ever really get sweet. You have to process them with a lot of sugar, but you can use them just like you use regular cranberries. The bush can get to be 10 feet by 10 feet. I planted them in an area where the water table is usually above the ground, and they're thriving. We're in a drought now here, but they're still very happy. So if you can have the space for a big plant, because they will grow big, and I never prune them, by the way, they don't need any care at all. It's very attractive in 4 seasons. If you have the space and you have wet ground, I think, these would really be beautiful in your property. Juniper. So this is native actually to the Rocky Ridges on my island. It is very drought. It's a evergreen. It grows only 3 feet tall and it spreads out horizontally. Extremely drought tolerant. The one on the lower left is growing out of a rocky ridge. I mean, it's just growing out of the rocks. So if you have a really dry spot, this will do well for you. It has edible berries that take about 3 years to mature, and they're used to flavor gin. I've also used them as a rub for a roast. They have medicinal value. And this bush is really good habitat for low nesting birds because it's nice and dense and it's close to the ground and it's evergreen. So it being evergreen, it gives you a little color, in your garden in the winter season. The lower right is a picture of it in the early spring before anything's leafed out. And it's a little bit on the brown side then before it leaves out and turns a brighter green color. But I'm sure there's probably other medicinal uses for the plant. I'm not an herbalist, so I'm not really familiar with the details of medicinal applications. But if you want a low growing evergreen that has edible berries, that's native and that's great habitat for birds. It's a good one. You need it. I don't think it would do well in wet soil though. I think it needs nice, well-drained, droughty soil. Honeyberries. So honeyberries are native. They're very cold tolerant. They grow around the Arctic Circle as well as in a little warmer climates. It's an edible honeysuckle. So there are many cultivars. You need 2 different cultivars for pollination. And the berry is about the size of a blueberry. It has the same blueberry blush, but compared to blueberries, I think these are far superior. First of all, they don't need acid soil. They're drought tolerant. There's no disease or pest. Even the deer don't like them. I think it's because our woods are infested with invasive honeysuckle. And I think the deer are so sated on that, they don't touch these, even when they're available. So there are no pests. They bloom and fruit a month earlier than any blueberries I know. So they fruit in June. And again, even with those hard frosts in May, they were still flowering. They flowered. I had a bumper crop of honeyberries this year. So very resilient. They form on the lower left, you can see the bushes. They form these rounded, pretty rounded bushes with nice bright leaves. They can grow in partial shade or sun. You know, just really adaptable. Not too, their one downside is they are rather time consuming to pick because the berries are underneath the branches. The branches grow pretty thickly. So you kind of get in there and, you know, it's a little tricky to pick them. Commercially, there are certain cultivars where the berries actually fall off when they're ripe. So they're harvested by shaking the bush and catching the berries on a tarp or something. But they're not that interesting in the fall, lower right, but in the winter, some of the branches have these, what I call collars, woody collars. So they kind of have a little interest even against the snow. I just love them. I don't grow blueberries in my edible forest because I don't have acid soil. And the whole idea is not to do any amending. And I would have to amend repeatedly if I, to make it acidic enough for blueberries. So these are a great substitute and they're attractive and they're, resilient and just good fruit, very tasty. So you can use them any way you use blueberries. When you eat them, let me say this first. You have to net them because in June, the birds are hungry. They're feeding their young and they're very attracted to blue fruit. So if you don't net them, you won't get any because they start turning blue about 3 weeks before they're really ripe enough to eat fresh. And when they do get ripe enough to eat fresh, they puff out. So this picture, you can see they're kind of puffed out. They're more of a long, narrow berry, but then when they get super sweet, they start puffing out, and that's when you know they're sweet. But you can still pick them at this stage and use them for processing, pies or jams or anything, throw them in cereal, whatever you want to do. Okay, moving on. Juneberry. So Juneberries are another native. They are kind of more like a blueberry. They're in the apple family. Because of that, in my heavy clay, they're prone to every disease in the book and every pest. I have not been successful. The only time I've ever had any fruit, and I've had them in for 11 years, was this year. Because we had an extremely dry May and the ground was dry. And so they didn't get fungus in the berries. But most years I have fungal spores growing out of my berries. Doesn't matter. Beautiful flowers in the spring. The lower picture here is actually them growing wild on a rocky ridge right across the street from my house on my property. So they're very drought tolerant. They're pretty in bloom. There are cultivars that grow to be 20 or 20 foot tall trees, and they have an elegant shape. And they have small leaves, so a lot of light can come through underneath, so you could underplant things. They're pretty specimen plants. If you're lucky, there are cultivars that are developed for bigger and better fruit, and they're more like bushes, so you can get those. If you have a sandy loam, I think, or any kind of well-drained soil, they probably do well for you. And again, it's a fruit that you're going to have in June. You might need to net them for the birds. But they taste a little like blueberries, and a lot of people really like them. So if you have the right kind of habitat, they may do very well for you. They're also quite attractive in the fall. The right hand shows you the different colors of the leaves. Northern bayberry. All right. This is actually a nitrogen fixing plant, as well as having edible leaves and berries that they use to make the iconic bayberry candles. It can tolerate wet soil. It does like sun, but it can tolerate very, very wet soil. The leaves, it's like a fresh bay leaf. So the chefs just love them because when can you get a fresh bay leaf? You never can. I mean, regular bay leaves that you buy dried as a spice, they're Mediterranean plants. They grow in very hot, arid, they wouldn't survive up here, but this does, and it's very much like a bayberry leaf, and it's fresh. And like I said, the chefs love it. In the winter, sometimes they hold their leaves, so they're even attractive, have little color in the winter. They can grow to be about 8 by 8, but you can keep them very small by pruning, which is what I do because I sell a lot of the leaves on stems to the chefs. So I keep them pretty small. And just a carefree plant that'll grow in the wet and give you edible leaves and also berries that are very useful and probably have medicinal value as well, and fixes nitrogen. Sand cherry. So sand cherry, what does that sound like? Maybe it grows well in the sand. Yes. Drought tolerant, needs really well-drained soil. It has a fruit that's about the size of a little smaller maybe than a commercial cherry. And if you leave them on the vine until they get sweet, the flesh is really sweet and succulent. The skin stays a little tart, but it's like a sweet cherry, and it's native, and it grows in harsh conditions. Flowers pretty in the spring, fruit, pretty leaves in the fall. It has a kind of sprawling growth habit. I put mine in a hedge that was supposed to be a windbreak. It's not really good for a windbreak because it doesn't really grow that tall and straight and bushy. It kind of spreads out horizontally. But I bought more and planted more in a well-drained place because I really like the fruit and they're carefree. Okay, now we're doing herbaceous and vines. So anise hyssop. This is native to the prairies, I believe, of the US. It's an anise flavored herb. The flowers and the leaves are both edible, mild, sweet licorice flavor. The flowers are easy to sprinkle. You can kind of shred them and sprinkle them on a dessert, in a salad, on a main course, however you want to use it. Very attractive to pollinators. There's actually 3 bumblebees on this one stalk. It's a perennial herb. It also self-seeds. So I planted mine on top of a well-drained hugel. It likes the sun and it likes well-drained soil. On the top of a well-drained hugelkultur mound on the south, kind of south-facing, and it has continued to grow for me there for 11 years. It's self-seeding, it's moving around a little bit, but it's still producing delicious leaves and flowers. The chefs love them, and they're attractive in bouquets as well, and very attractive to native pollinators. Okay, giant Solomon seal. It's native. Most people don't know that you can eat the shoots when they first come up like asparagus. You can harvest them and eat them like asparagus. It's a shade-loving plant, grows great in the shade. Those of you who do perennial flowers are probably quite familiar with it. Lovely, flowers hanging from the stalk. They turn it's just starting to turn here, a pale yellow in the fall. They're suckering plants, so they'll spread naturally out. I wouldn't harvest them all until you have quite a clump, and then just harvest a few if you want to eat them. But just a lovely native, shade-loving, edible, herbaceous plant. Sunchokes. So these are native. They are in the sunflower family. They grow extremely tall, like 8 or 10 feet tall. They'll flower in September. Then they're herbaceous, so the stems die off. I usually wait till early spring when the ground defrosts to harvest them because they sweeten up. So the upper right are the sunchokes. They're tubers. Maybe 2 inches long, 1.5 inches wide. They're all different varieties. The ones I grow happen to have magenta skin, some have brown skin, maybe different flavors. There's quite a few different varieties. But I harvest them in the spring when they sweeten up. I've made a stir fry with them. I've used them instead of potatoes in a frittata. I like to slice them thin and fry them like a sweet potato chip. They're really delicious that way. And you dig them in the spring. You dig as many as you can find. You have to do that. It's like dandelions. If you don't dig them, they tend to choke each other's out, and they're gonna kind of degrade. But you'll never find them all, so they'll come back up, that year again. They do tend to spread, so you need to be careful where you plant them or have a way to control their spread. The other thing is, since they do grow so tall and you see how dense the foliage is, they will shade anything to the north. So you're going to want to plant them to the north of anything that needs sun. But other than that, pretty carefree. And they could be a trap crop for rodents. So rodents tend to girdle the stems of things like cherry trees and bushes under the snow in the winter. And Sepp Holzer suggests that you can plant these nearby, and maybe the rodents will eat these tubers instead of the bark off of your precious bushes and trees. So I'm trying that. I planted them here. They're planted in an edible hedge next to some cherry bushes, and I'm hoping that the rodents will prefer them to the cherries. I can't tell yet, but I'm hoping. Strawberries. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Most of you are familiar with strawberries. They're either June bearers or they're everbearers. I like the everbearers because they bloom and flower on and off throughout the season, even into November, if the conditions are right. They need some moisture and sun, of course. But I like these in terms of aesthetic appeal. These are a couple of cultivars that I really like. This is Tarpon F1. It has these deep red flowers and small but very delicious strawberries. And this is called Gasana F1, bigger pink blossoms and bigger delicious berries. And this is a clumper. This is a runner. So this spreads by running. This mostly clumps. And they're beautiful and they're edible and they flower and fruit throughout the season. These are alpine strawberries. Now, the others need really full sun, but alpines can take some shade. They have they're mostly clumpers. They're also everbearing, so they'll flower and fruit on and off throughout the season. Very small, petite berries, but very intense in flavor. So they're a great edible ground cover. And then these are wild strawberries, which many of you may be familiar with. So they move in on their own to cover the ground in some of my beds, and I'm delighted to have them because I don't have to plant something. And they flower and fruit in June. Very small, tasty berries. And and strawberries tend to turn pretty colors in the fall. So they make great ground covers, edible, native. Violets. So violets are native. The flowers and the leaves are edible, and they self-seed. Some are perennial where they self-seed. Here they're just coming up in the spring. They come up very early and they flower quite early, and then you'll have another flush of growth and flowering again in the fall. Here they're growing amongst horsetail, which is another native perennial, which has many positive virtues, which I'm not going to get into right now, but you can't get rid of it, so you might as well embrace it. That's my philosophy about horsetail. Anyway, violets, they're very easy to grow, very drought tolerant. Well, they like moisture, they can take a little shade, but here they are growing in some fine rocks, in a rocky road, and they're doing fine. So they have pretty deep roots. So they're pretty versatile and easy, very easy, and they'll self-seed and cover your ground really well. So here are a couple of vines. So groundnut and hog peanut, they're both native, they're both legumes. The groundnut, and they're both herbaceous. So the groundnut has really attractive flowers, I think, and it'll grow maybe 6-10 feet tall and then die back, over the the fall and winter. Underground on strings they look like dark beads on strings, are these edible tubers that are like potatoes. You can cook them any way you cook potatoes. They have a little more protein than potatoes, but they're small. They're maybe an inch by an inch, or sometimes more oval shaped. But an edible tuber that is very nutritious. Nitrogen, by the way, it's nitrogen fixing vine as well, and it's quite attractive. And then the hog peanut also is a native vine. These actually self-seed on the north slope, like a lower end of a north slope of hugelkultur mounds in my garden. So they like the shade and they like the moisture. The flowers aren't quite as attractive as these guys, but they also have edible parts. So they have pods, another nitrogen fixing legume. The pods and the seeds inside are edible. And down where the stem, either right below or right above the ground where the stem meets the ground, are these guys, which are almost like peanuts. That's why it's called a hog peanut, that are also edible. So maybe it's called a hog peanut because hogs like to eat them too. But these are growing. This is growing up, I think, a stem of a red currant. So these guys don't start growing till kind of late in the season. By the time they wind up the red currant, the currants have already been harvested, so they're not doing any harm, and they're fixing nitrogen and they're providing some food for the humans and the wildlife, of course. So I just let them be. Oh, we're getting to the end. So I just want to show you a native plant arrangement in wet ground. So I talked about several of these plants that all can tolerate wet. The high bush cranberry, the aronia, the I can't see my labels, but the bayberry, the northern bayberry. There's an American plum that's doing okay now that I control the deer. A speckled alder, I didn't talk about. It's also native, nitrogen fixing, and feeds wildlife. So these are all things that can grow in wet ground. And this is just an arrangement of, the Russian comfrey is not native, an arrangement that I have in my garden that I just thought I'd share. And here it is in the fall. So I've been having issues trying to figure out what to cover the ground with here. So I threw a oat seed on the ground, like probably the last week in August, first week in September, to form a mulch. And then, it gets winter killed. And so it formed a mulch for the spring to maybe keep some weeds down while I was figuring out what I was going to plant. So as a cover crop, I just threw oats on the ground. I love to use oats as a fall cover crop because it gets winter killed. It leaves a nice mat of like a straw over the ground. So that's, I hope I'm within a good time frame here. I don't have a clock, but this is my book, The Home Scale Forest Garden. It's on sale everywhere online, and I think it's going to be at your conference. Everything I talked about and much, much more is in the book. And some resources. So Coldstream Farm is in the upper Midwest. It sells bare root trees and it has a lot of these natives. So I would really recommend them. They have really good prices. And if you buy quantity, the price drops precipitously. And they also sell them in different heights, like 6 inches, 12 inches, 2 feet, whatever. So there's a lot of options. Prairie Moon Nursery also specializes in all kinds of natives. They do sell some bare root woody plants, and they sell a lot of seeds. So that is the other resource I would recommend. And then I know I spoke at a conference a couple of years ago, and someone wanted to know what plants were native for their town. So I would say, if you want to know what's actually native in your town, because what I've talked about are things that are native to the continent, actually. You can try to Google books on native food plants, for Worcester, let's say, and then see what you come up with. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
All right, thank you, Dani. That was amazing. I learned a lot.
Oh, great.
So we have, as of right now, I think 4 questions. As we answer these, hopefully it'll spark some more questions and conversations. I'm
Great.
going to start with Scott's question, which is the most recent question.
Okay.
Are violets considered a ground cover pollinator attractor?
I would say so. I mean, I've seen bees, of course, and they're early. They flower early. I mean, one of the things you want to do when you create a landscape is to have something flowering from as early in the season as possible to as late in the season. I mean, not the same plant, but something blooming. So you're feeding your pollinators. So when your fruit trees or berry bushes need pollination, the pollinators are already around. So yeah, I would say so.
All right. Let's see. And the next question is from Deborah. Are any of the plants discussed not deer resistant? I know we covered a lot, but if you can think of it.
Well, are that not, you mean, are any of them deer resistant? Is that the question or not? I think deer will eat everything but the honeyberry, in my experience. Yeah, because of if you don't have invasive honeysuckle in your region, they might eat the honeyberry too. I use electric fences. Really, our island is way overpopulated with deer, so much so that the woods are not regenerating because they eat everything that grows that they can reach. So I've come up with some different ways to deal with deer, several different kinds of fencing, and also what I call my upside down tomato cages, which I put around seedlings and wrap with chicken wire to a height that when the seedling exceeds that height, the deer can't reach it anymore, and then I take it off. So I talk about these things in my book, but I don't, if you have a lot of deer pressure, they'll eat just about everything, even things that are supposed to be deer resistant. So, I can't, a good electric fence that you bait with peanut butter sandwiches, that's what I would recommend. Other questions?
Yeah, so these 2 questions were posed before the workshop actually started on Whova. So the first one is, can I grow native perennial plants in raised beds?
I don't see why not. Would this be a raised bed that is on the ground, or would this be a raised bed that has like a wooden base and is maybe 6 inches deep?
I don't have that context.
Okay, well, I would say, if it's deep enough, depending on the root structure of the plant, yes or no. I mean, depending on how deep your bed is and depending on the root structure of the plant. Now, I will say this, I am planning to add a different dimension to my garden. I'm going to do a square foot garden in a bed that's only 6 inches deep. And I'm going to plant perennials, maybe some natives, like certainly some native herbs. Anyway, and those I think would do fine, like chives, certain herbs would do fine. The roots aren't that deep. Some perennial vegetables would do fine, I think. I wouldn't put a woody shrub in there, 6 inches. Maybe honeyberry. You could do honeyberry because I planted honeyberry. Okay, when I built my road, my contractor left about 1.5 feet of crusher run uncovered by the 6-inch thick slabs of what is that? Limestone. So I had bare crusher run 6 inches below the surface of the ground. And I said, what am I going to plant there? So I filled it with wood chips, which gradually decayed. And then I had bought these extra, by the way, Tundra is one of my favorite honeyberry cultivars. I had a dozen Tundras I had bought. I didn't know where I was going to put them. I thought, I know they're drought tolerant. Let me put them there. And guess what? They're doing great. So they're only in 6 inches of soil above stone. So I would say that, yes, honeyberries could do it.
Cool. All right, so we have 1 question left. I'm just going to put this out to everybody. If you have any questions, drop them in the chat. If there's not any by the time Dani finishes answering the last question, I'm going to move into the concluding notes. But the last question is, I'm sold on native plants, but where can I buy them?
So I told you about Coldstream Farm. And there also, I think more and more nurseries, local nurseries are starting to specialize in natives. I think if you Google, and most of them do mail order, so it doesn't have to be near your home. If you Google, nurseries selling native plants, see what comes up and then investigate them and see what suits your fancy.
Okay, looks like Matt just dropped a question. How do you incorporate Huga? I'm not totally sure how to pronounce it. Huga culture into edible forests?
Okay, yeah, I actually have incorporated them in many ways. I built two 50-foot long hugelkultur mounds in my original garden. A backhoe did that. Okay, I used machinery in my first garden, my first half acre. My second half acre, no machinery. So I built two 50-foot long ones because I wanted to improve. I have heavy clay. I wanted to improve the drainage. So piling up, the wood and the soil. Actually, we took the clay from inside from the pond that was being dug and piled it up. But still, it created airspace. It loosened it up a little bit. Then I threw clover on top, so the roots of the clover really break it up. Anyway, I wanted to improve the drainage, so I raised the ground a little and loosened it up for my fruit trees. I did that. I did another hugelkultur mound in like a horseshoe shape, and I put a patio in the middle, and I put herbs and some trees on top of that. But in my second garden, I did a lot of hugels in the woods. So I've been giving these talks for a number of years, and when people hear forest garden, some people think I'm going to talk about growing things in an existing woods. And that's not what I was doing, but I thought, I'm going to try to do that so I can address that audience. So I built 10 hugelkultur mounds inside the woods. Now, this was a woods where the water table was often like several inches above the ground in spring and fall, and all winter long. And I built hugelkultur mounds there to get away from the root competition from the trees, to get away from the water, to raise the soil, level above the water. And I've planted a whole bunch of shade-loving plants there. Now, this is relatively new experiment. It's just the second year, but I have redbud, pawpaw, persimmon trees growing on top of the mound. And then I have things like red and pink currants, growing, around, and like sorrel and daylilies are blooming in the shade. I was surprised at that. So, just kind of experimenting with what I can grow in the shade. So that's another way that I've implemented them. And I mean, they're so versatile. They create so many different microclimates, and they improve the soil. If you have soil issues, like if I was consulting to someone who wanted to grow stuff where the soil was very thin and there was rock underneath, I'd recommend they build hugelkultur mounds and just get up above that and put in some more organic matter and grow stuff on there. So yeah, those are some of the ways I integrated them.
Nice. So looks like Scott asked another question that I'm just going to answer because it relates more so to just the conference than it does the workshop. Well, I guess it relates to the workshop, but Scott's just wondering if the presentation file is available to us. So this entire thing has been recorded. We will talk with Dani afterwards to see if they are willing to share the file with us. But I believe that the video recording will be available to everybody. And I also took notes on this and got, I think, 95% of all the plants covered. So yes, feel free to follow up after Scott. If there's any other questions, drop them in the chat real quick. If not, I'm going to move into the end.
Can I just say something real quick?
Oh, absolutely.
No, I just want to let people know, tomorrow night at 7, I'm doing something on hosting beneficial creatures in your farmer garden. So I'm going to talk about all the ways you can invite birds and pollinators and beneficial insects and amphibians and whatever, you name it, into your garden, to do the work for you. That's all.
Nice. And when did you say that class was?
Tomorrow at 7.
Okay, tomorrow at 7. Cool. All right. It looks like we got another question in the meanwhile. What could I plant next to, under, or above my oranges, elderberries, apple tree, pear tree, raspberries? So not to make new beds because I have edible and pollinator beds all over, which drives my husband crazy because there's still lawn to mow.
Okay, I don't understand the question. Would you read the
Yeah.
first part again?
What can I plant next to, above, or under my elderberries, apple trees, pear trees, raspberries, to basically not make new beds?
Okay, well, I have fruit trees growing up among my raspberries. In fact, I just planted an Asian pear, a new, whip of an Asian pear. I planted 3 new Asian pears this year. The one that's right in the middle of my raspberries is doing better than any of the others. So you can grow trees out of raspberries. In nature, that's what happens. First, you get your shrubs and brambles, then you get your trees growing out of them, right? Now, under elderberries, well, you know what I do with my elderberries? I actually have some black raspberries growing right around my elderberries, and I trellis them on my elderberries. So there's an idea. And what were the other plants that she mentioned? Oh, under her fruit trees?
Yeah,
Apple trees, apples. I would plant anything under an apple that's not in the apple family. So I wouldn't necessarily put a Juneberry under there because that's in the apple family, but certainly a honeyberry, or an aronia, because they can take some shade. Maybe the clove currant. Yeah, I put it on the sunny side, but I wouldn't put it to the north of your. But yeah, but to the north you could put your what was that? Your giant Solomon seal, edible. I guess, I mean, there's so many things you can do. If you think about all the layers on a forest edge, this garden is modeled after a forest edge. So on a forest edge, you have the tallest trees, shortest trees, bushes, ground covers, herbaceous, you have vines curling up. There's lots of sun that comes in there. So you can have a whole lot of things growing. And if you model your garden like that, if you leave, you're not going to build it, you're not going to plant a forest. You're going to have, like you said, you have lots of beds. So you're going to have light coming around that bed, and you can build up high and low and just have every layer very abundant, very productive. And in nature, they all go together. They grow together in nature. So why not do it in your garden?
Yes. Cool. So I'm seeing in the comments a lot of people thanking you for a great presentation. I would just like to add to those words and say thank you. This has been amazing. I knew very little about this topic going into this, and you both educated me and just made it fun. So
inspired you, I hope. But I just want to say, I do tours of my garden. If anybody is up my way or wants to come up my way to actually see it, there's something to hear about it. But if you actually see it, taste it, smell it, it's a different experience. So, and there will be a TV show. We're doing it. My local PBS station is going to produce a TV show that's going to go national based on my garden. It's going to start with 8 episodes. So look for that in about 1.5 years.
dang, that's super neat. I'm gonna have to pay attention to that. Cool. Well, everybody, so it seems like based off the comments I'm seeing, a lot of people enjoyed this workshop. We do have an evaluation that if you could fill out, the feedback would be immensely helpful to nofamass. If you can't get to it now, no worries, but the sooner the better. And then just a reminder, I know I mentioned the auction in the beginning, but it's a major fundraising tool. So if you could check that out, bid on anything you're interested in, that would be amazing. There's some amazing items in there. All auction proceeds go to support year-round programming and advocacy work. So if you're able to, bid generously. And I think that concludes everything from my end.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks. Anything else, Christine?
No, that's it. Thanks, everyone. And Dani, great presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I enjoyed giving it. Thank you very much.
All right, cool. Well, have an amazing evening, everybody. And once again, thank you, Dani.
Thank you. Okay. So, oh, did you want to know if I'm willing to share my stuff?
Oh, yeah, I figured we could discuss that via email, but if we're willing
Okay.
to commit now, that's cool.
Yeah. So what do you want?
I think we're looking for the PowerPoint presentation. If you could just share the file.
Didn't I already? Can't you just take it from this? Or we had issues with that. I don't do Google. You don't have Dropbox.
Okay, maybe this is something we should continue via email.
Okay.
But the recording will be on the nofamass YouTube channel after the end of the conference as well. So we
That's
can
fine.
be sending out the link to all of those at the end of the conference.
Great. Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.